Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we continue our series on Emerson. We are up to Journal 19, and it begins with a note from the editor. Some letters written by Emerson to his brothers and aunt during winter and spring of this year, which are quoted by Mr. Cabot in his memoirs, show the good sense with which at this critical period he yielded to necessity instead of fighting fate like his brother Edward. Thus the elder brother saved, and the valiant younger brother lost his life. In one of these letters Waldo says, "I am living cautiously, yea, treading on eggs, to strengthen my constitution. It is a long battle, this of mine, between life and death. So I never write when I walk, and especially when I can laugh." This accounts for the scanty journal writing in this year, and he refused many flattering invitations to preach. Thus his proper health gradually reasserted itself. January 1828. Montaigne says he is sorry Brutus's treatise on virtue is lost, because he would hear one who so well understood the practice discuss the theory of virtue. 'Tis well said, "It is always dangerous when an appeal is made from the sermon to the preacher, when the bold reason of the hearer quotes his life against his doctrine." Demades told the Athenians that he had observed that they never treated of peace except in black cloves. So, says Plutarch, men never reduce their diet except amidst cataplasms, clysters, and medicines. So also men do not turn for enjoyment to another world till their hopes in this have failed them. Quote, "Age gives good advice when it is no longer able to give a bad example." End quote. We think ill of a man who has an ill gait, or a defective utterance, or bad countenance, and shun his acquaintance, but a man who wastes his time does not excite aversion. It has been observed that particular sects have their own physiognomy, but we keep the same face and air from year to year. It shows that we have wasted our time. It is said public opinion will not bear it. Really? Public opinion, I am sorry to say, will bear a great deal of nonsense. There is scarce any absurdity so gross, whether in religion, politics, science, or manners, which it will not bear. It will bear the amazing conference of New Lebanon. It will bear Andrew Jackson for president. It will bear the convicted ignorance of Captain Sims. It will bear the obscenities of the Boston Theater. Lord Bacon never spoke truer words than when he said, "There's more of the fool in the world than the wise." I have once or twice been apprehensive that I was reading in vain, that the cultivation of my mind did not turn to any good account in my intercourse with men. I am now satisfied of the contrary. I have every inch of my merits. More is conceded to me than I have just title to. I am oftener compelled to deplore my ignorance than to be pleased with my knowledge. I have no knowledge that I do not want. January 1828. In Concord, New Hampshire, I visited the prison and went into the cells. At this season they shut up the convicts in these little granite chambers at about 4 o'clock p.m. and let them out about 7 o'clock a.m., 15 dreadful hours. Extracts from Wordsworth. Quote, "But in calm peace the appointed victim slept, as he had fallen in magnanimity of spirit too capacious to require that destiny her course should change." End quote. Quote, "Tens of thousands rent from off the tree of hopeful life, by battle's whirlwind blown into the deserts of eternity." 3:218. Quote, "Not in entire forgetfulness, and not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come from God, who is our home." End quote. Intimations of Immortality. Quote, "From Cambrian wood and moss Druids descend, auxiliaries of the cross, bards nursed on blue Plinimon's still abode." End quote. Ecclesiastical Sonnet 10. Quote, there is a radiant but a short-lived flame that burns for poetry in the dawning east. End quote. Quote, know that he who feels contempt for any living thing hath faculties which he never used. That thought with him is in its infancy. End quote. Lines left upon a seat in a yew tree. Quote, intent to trace the ideal path of right, more fair than heaven's broad causeway paved with stars, which Dion learned to measure with delight. End quote. Dion. Quote, a soul by force of sorrows high, uplifted to the purest sky of undisturbed humanity. End quote. Quote, how touching when at midnight sweep snow-muffled winds, and all is dark. End quote. Sonnet number 1 on the river Dudon. Quote, from her unworthy seat the cloudy stall of time breaks forth triumphant memory. End quote. Quote, but shapes that come not at an earthly call will not depart when mortal voices bid. End quote. Notes on Poetry. A fault that strikes the readers of Mr. Wordsworth is the direct pragmatical analysis of objects in their nature poetic, but which all other poets touch incidentally. He mauls the moon and the waters and the bulrushes as his main business. Milton and Shakespeare touch them gently as illustration or ornament. Beds of flowers send up a most grateful scent to the passenger who hastens by them, but let him pitch his tent among them, and he will find himself grown insensible to their fragrance. And it must have occurred frequently to our reader that brilliant moonlight will not bear acquaintance. Nothing is more glorious than the full moon to those who ride or walk under its beams. But whoso goes out of doors expressly to see it returns disappointed. Mr. Wordsworth is a poet with the same error that wasted the genius of the alchemists and astrologers of the Middle Age. These attempted to extort by direct means the principle of life, the secret substance of matter from material things, and those to extract intelligence from remoter nature, instead of observing that science is ever approximating to truth by dint of application to present wants, and not by search after general and recondite truth. Mr. Wordsworth is trying to distill the essence of poetry from poetic things, instead of being satisfied to adorn common scenes with such lights from these sources of poetry as nature will always furnish to her true lovers. We feel the same sort of regret that is occasioned when Aristotle forsakes the laws of the intellect and the principles of ethics for researches into the nature of mind. Quote, the man who shows his heart is hooted for his nudities and scorned. End quote. Young. There is a great difference between good poetry and everlasting poetry. Shakespeare alludes to himself nowhere in his drama. The sonnets, Homer keeps out of sight except in 2 places, a grand trait. It is like Providence, vide Herder, Mem. Pope's account of his own resemblance to Providence in my blotting book, A Different Age. In antiquity, nature towered above all men had done. It sunk the personal importance of man. The bard taught as the minister preaches, and felt an impertinence in introducing self. Now man has grown bigger, a commercial, political canaling, writing animal. Philosophy inverts itself, and poetry grows egotistical. Shakespeare immortalizes his characters. They live to every age and, as we say of Christianity, have a prospective adaptation. Ben Jonson's are all dead. Read Alchemist and the rest. They are all in brocade. We feel that they are past generation, our great-grandfathers and mothers, and so their motives and manners are in brocade, not vital to us. As the euphemism of one, but universal man appreciates Shakespeare. Boys, rabble, every man of strong sense, though uncultivated as, and the name has been left blank. Exceptions rare. Gibbon. But he had no acumen for poetry. That ear was deaf. Witness his poetical opinions and notes. So Dr. Priestley, I guess, had no ear. He calls Mrs. Barbauld one of his best poets England can boast of. See his life, page 69. Milton does not get this general suffrage. I find today one of Shakespeare's quibbles Miranda tells Ferdinand, who carries wood to the pile, quote, "When this burns, 'twill weep for having wearied you." End quote. February 1828. A very unaccountable poem, that Pelican Island. A mixture of greatness with defects that don't appear to be slovenliness, like the slovenly greatness of Dryden, so much as want of delicate poetic perception. But all along at intervals glitter lines that might decorate Paradise Lost. And there's a general grandeur of conception, but in the minor poems he is decidedly an ordinary genius again. It is the singular merit of the Pelican Island that 'tis original both in the design, which perhaps makes all its greatness, and in the execution. It is a poem worth 10 excursions, being generally a complete contrast to Wordsworth's verses. These abounding in fact, and Wordsworth wanting. These seizing coarse and tangible features for description or allusion, and Wordsworth the metaphysical and evanescent. This teaching body, and Wordsworth's soul. This using a very large encyclopedical diction, and Wordsworth affecting that which may be proper to the passions in common life. It seems to me that who could write this could write 10 times as well. Milton could write it off in unpremeditated manuscript and lay it up as a block to be hewn and carved and polished. But Milton would as soon have hanged himself as published it as it stands. Had it been found and printed by Montgomery's executors, instead of Montgomery, it would not surprise. The puzzle is that there's quite a large portion of the poem is mere extemporaneous blank verse, only fit for the fount of a newspaper. Divinity Hall, February 14th, 1828. Burnap was very witty tonight. He said there was one man who had the queerest reputation, Dr. Watts. Such a mixture of heathenism and scholastic learning and Calvinism and love and despair and mullygrubs. He was the funniest old cock in the theological walk. That old Betty should be one of the 3 legs that support the Trinity, and that the church should go chanting his hymns for centuries, mistaking the effusions of bellyache for the inspirations of David, as was the greatest phenomenon. Then that he should write a treatise on logic, and then on the improvement of the mind. Then that his sun should set off clear after being foggy all day. And Dr. Doddridge, who owed all his fame to his getting up at 5 o'clock every morning and writing for 2 hours what everybody knew and said before. Religion aims to make a man at peace with himself. A man who is angry is not at peace with himself, or who is proud, or who stills. And as we cannot determine the place of the ship on the heaving sea except by reference to the immovable sun, so we find it impossible to determine the state of the soul without something outside, some fixed idea, as that of God. I would ask, what is God? With what awe which becomes a man in his inquiry. It is no idle curiosity. It is what we are made for. The answer we offer to the question is always an unerring index of the purity of our religious views. A savage will make one reply, a sage another, an angel another, and as their views of God are, their views of man and duty will be. Divinity Hall, March 10th, 1828. If you are in habits of intimacy with men, you have sometimes known 2 of your friends come to you at different times, and each giving the character of the other, lament that he had not judgment. The fact probably was that both were right, for both wanted it. Judge Spencer of New York, who was left out in new modeling of the courts in that state, told Judge Lyman that Mr. Otis came to see him on his way from Washington, and, quote, "I said to him, 'Well, old friend, we are both disappointed. I have fallen, and you have failed to rise,' end quote. And I was very much mortified to have said this, for I found it touched Mr. Otis to the quick," end quote. Shortly after Mr. Otis came to Northampton and dined with Judge Lyman and spoke of his visit to Spencer and the conversation and remarked, quote, that it really made him ashamed to see how much Judge Spencer was offended by so trifling a thing as this political disappointment, end quote. And how was the truth? I inquired of Judge Lyman. Oh, said he, both felt it very much. Emerson writes on Office of Religion. Men entertain very gross prejudices touching the very nature of religion. I speak of good plausible people that go to church for decency's sake, but do not obey the commandments nor observe the ordinances. They think it is a train of solemn pageants that we wish them to entertain in the mind, to lengthen the visage, to make long prayers, to read long sermons, and not to fulfill their duties to the universe. They are living. All the true aim of religion is to set them right, enlighten them. They are on a wrong scent. They are undoing themselves. They are living like animals. We would have them live like men. They are acting for 30 or 40 years. We would have them act as sentry plants. They are scheming and talking as if they belonged, like a toad or a groundworm, to the acre on which they were born. They never leave the shop. They are village statesmen, cob house architects. We have found out that, though in the disguise of these rags, they are come of an imperial family, that they are heirs of heaven and earth. Tidings have come full of astonishment and transport that their life, that seemed running fast to the last sands, is to be prolonged by a decree of omnipotence, that it is not to be wasted any more in low places, but they are to be removed to the company of majestic minds and an infinite spectacle, that they are now to owe duties to the sovereign of the universe and to all the vast circle of intelligent beings. Observe, a prejudice exists that we would call them to a life of contemplation, and the nature of man demands a life of action. They would have reason, but it is not so. We call them to a life of action. We understand their ignorance. We find unutterably dear and beautiful what they esteemed, and what we once esteemed sad and tragic. Joy is grave. Emerson speaks on Do Not Overrate Action. We are very apt to overrate the importance of our actions. Men of very religious turn of mind are apt to think, at least their language gives this impression, that the designs of God in the world are very much affected by, if not dependent upon, what shall be done or determined by themselves or their society or their country. We lose ourselves in the details of the prejudice till we are blind to the absurdity that we are making the everlasting progress of the universe hang upon the bylaws of a missionary society or a Sunday school. The true way to consider things is this. Truth says, give yourself no matter of anxiety about events, about the consequences of actions. They are really of no importance to us. They have another director, controller, guide. The whole object of the universe to us is the formation of character. If you think you came into being for the purpose of taking an important part in the administration of events, to guard a province of the moral creation from ruin, and that its salvation hangs on the success of your single arm, you have wholly mistaken your business. Creep into your grave, the universe hath no need of you. How foolish! For what hast thou which thou didst not receive? And cannot he who gave you this power commit it to another, or use it himself? It is proposed as a question whether the business of the preacher is not simply to hunt out and to exhibit the analogies between moral and material nature in such manner as to have a bearing upon practice. Concord, May 1828. I find a kindling excitement in the thought that the feeling which prompts a child to an act of generosity is the same which guides an archangel to his awful duties, that in the humblest transaction in which we can engage, we can introduce these stupendous laws which make the sovereignty of the creation the character of God. It seems to me in obeying them, and squaring my conduct by them, I part with the weakness of humanity. I exchange the rags of my nature for a portion of the majesty of my Maker. I am backed by the universe of beings. I lean on omnipotence. Emerson speaks of friends. The character of our friends is a sacred property which is very important to us. In moments when our faith wavers, when we are disturbed with melancholy doubts, the unfailing refuge of the mind is in that little honored number of good men and women among our friends, whose probity is our anchor, that, like a squadron of angels, gather on the mount before us and send out from their seraph faces courage and light into our hearts. There is something respectable in being master of the tongue. Consider the force of character, the impressiveness of the silence of a good man. I have known a pause in speech to do more than a harangue. Consider also the beneficent consequences of collecting and reporting the good of all men. Divinity Hall, July 10th, 1828. I am always made uneasy when the conversation turns in my presence upon popular ignorance and the duty of adapting our public harangues and writings to the mind of the people. 'Tis all pedantry and ignorance. The people know as much and reason as well as we do, none so quick as they to discern brilliant genius or solid parts. And I observe that all those who use this cant most are such that do not rise above mediocrity of understanding. Emerson writes on saunterings. I am not so enamored of liberty as to love to be idle, but the only evil I find in idleness is unhappiness. I love to be my own master when my spirits are prompt, when my brain is vigid and apt for thought. If I were richer, I should lead a better life than I do, that is, better divided and more able. I should ride on horseback a good deal. I should bowl, and create an appetite for my studies by intermixing some heat and labors in affairs. The chief advantage I should propose myself in wealth would be the independence of manner and conversation it would bestow, and which I eagerly covet and seldom quite attain, and in some companies never. It is a peculiarity, I find by observation upon others, of humor in me, my strong propensity for strolling. I deliberately shut up my books on a cloudy June noon, put on my old clothes and old hat, and slink away to the whortleberry bushes, and slip with the greatest satisfaction into a little cow path, where I am sure I can defy observation. This point gained, I solace myself for hours with picking blueberries and other trash of the woods, far from fame, behind the birch trees. I seldom enjoy hours as I do these. I remember them in winter. I expect them in spring. I do not know a creature that I think has the same humor or would think it respectable. Yet the friend, the Anteros whom I seek through the world, now in cities, now in wilderness, now at sea, will know the delight of sauntering with the melancholy Jacques. When I consider the constitutional calamity of my family, which in its falling upon Edward has buried at once so many towering hopes, with whatever reason, I have little apprehension of my own liability to the same evil. I have so much mixture of silliness in my intellectual frame that I think Providence has tempered me against this. My brother lived and acted and spoke with preternatural energy. My own manner is sluggish, my speech sometimes flippant, sometimes embarrassed and ragged. My actions, if I may say so, are of a passive kind. Edward had always great power of face. I have none. I laugh. I blush. I look ill-tempered, against my will and against my interest. But all this imperfection, as it appears to me, is a caput mortuum, is a ballast, as things go, is a defense. My practice conforms more to the Epicurean than to the Stoic rule. Quote, I will be flesh and blood, for there was never yet philosopher that could endure the toothache patiently, however they have writ the style of gods, and made a pish at chance and sufferance. Woe is me, my brother, for you. Please God to rescue and restore him. Emerson writes on education. I like to have a man's knowledge comprehend more than one class of topics, one row of shelves. I like a man who likes to see a fine barn, as well as a good tragedy. Sir Henry Wotton says of the institutions of education that they are more important than the laws, because if young trees were at first well fastened at the root, they would little want any props and fence afterwards. He says also, by an analogy perhaps not so natural, that if such an unpliant and stubborn mineral as iron is will acquire by continuance a secret appetite and habitual inclination to the side it held before, how much more may we hope through the same means, education being nothing but a constant plight and inurement, to induce by custom good habits into a reasonable creature. See Survey of Education. There's a series of Latin sentences here that I will skip over. I do not love to be punctual because I love to be punctual. Emerson writes, Sketch for a Sermon by E.B.E. You are a son, and certain conduct you perceive to belong to you in this relation. You are a brother, and such duties, etc. You are a merchant. You belong to the city, and it is this or that in the deportment which makes up your virtue or your vice in your character as citizen. One step farther, you belong to this country as a confederacy of states, and hence come other new obligations. Farther still, you belong to mankind, and as a man owe something. But is this all? You belong to one still more extensive family, brotherhood, community, the universe. July 30th, 1828. A child is connected to the womb of its mother by a cord from the navel. So it seems to me is man connected to God by his conscience. God has given him a free agency, has permitted him to work his will in the world, doing wrong or right, but has kept open this door by which he may come in at all times and visit his sins with distress, or his virtues with pleasant thoughts. It is like the hydrostatic paradox, as naturalists call it, the ocean against a hairline of water, God against a human soul. Est Deus in nobis, etc., and when outraged, this Deus becomes Diabolus, a spectre that no exorcism will bind. Divinity Hall, August 18th, 1828. Keep a thing by you 7 years, and you shall find use for it. You will never waste knowledge. I like the sentence of Locke, quote, that young men in their warm blood are often forward to think that they have in vain learned to fence if they never show their skill in a duel. End quote. One of the great defects of this world is this, that it is not enough that an objection has been fully answered. In my simplicity, I should have thought Richardson's engaging novel of Sir Charles Grandison a settlement of the subject of dueling, that all the common prejudices on that question were manifestly shown to be paltry. But no, it must be hammered into the head of society as Latin nouns into the head of a blockhead at school. Then it follows 2 dates, October 31st, 1828, and February 11th, 1828. And there's a footnote that says, here follow 2 passages written in cipher. And I'm assuming those are not given, and what follows next is not the part of the cipher. Emerson writes on self-reliance. It is better to depend on yourself and to set at naught the judgment of society. Is it not better to get out of the vapors that settle in this low air, its deceptive echoes, its false valuations, and sketch the map of the country from mountain ground? Is it not better to scorn and avoid the heaving fluctuations of its public opinion, refuse to be the victim of its changing estimation, and be all the universe to yourself? Divinity Hall, September 11th. We are very powerful beings. Every mind may be brought to such a state as to have very little regard to inconvenience or physical obstructions. Let it be felt by us that we exist wholly in the mind, that all happiness is there and all unhappiness, that the present condition and appearance is nothing. Emerson writes briefly on situation. 'Tis a striking proof of the power of situation to drop a penknife or a glove upon the ground and see how they look there. Emerson writes on compensation. It is an important fact that a man carries about with him favor or disgrace. We impute our reception in society to the will of others, and forget that we ourselves alone determine what that reception shall be, that a man may always, before he enters the door of the house, forestall his welcome by consulting his own mind. It will render him a true and faithful reply. Do you not see that every misfortune is misconduct, that every honor is desert, that every affront is an insolence of your own? Don't you see you are the universe to yourself? You carry your fortunes in your own hand. Change of place won't mend the matter. You will weave the same web at Pernambuco as at Boston, if you have only learned how to make one texture. He that explores the principles of architecture and detects the beauty of the proportion of a column, what doth he but ascertain one of the laws of his own mind? The kingdom of God is within you. If you stammer in your talk or are cloudy, why then it is because your purpose is not pure. If the plan you explain is high-minded, generous on your part, why then the reason you stammer is because you tell it to get credit for your magnanimity. Emerson writes on reading. I read things in Montaigne, Caius, that you cannot, much as he said himself. I will give you Skugel, and you shall not find anything in it valuable to you. It sounds to the intelligent. The lapidary will let you choose a stone from a handful of crystals, knowing that your eye is not skillful enough to detect the unpolished diamond. I believe the law of justice is very hard to keep. As to charity, you can't help being charitable. It is easier to give than it is to withhold on 20 occasions. But justice lasts all the time and never mitigates her claim, and after all is a pitiful performance, for it never deserves praise. You can only sing, "We are unprofitable servants." In a tavern everybody puts on airs except the landlord. He is the poor devil, and the commonest sot of a teamster thinks he has the advantage of him. Emerson writes on beauty. It is hard to yoke love and wisdom. It is hard to criticize the behavior of beauty. In her magic presence, reason becomes ashamed of himself and wears the aspect of pedantry or calculation. Sentiment triumphs, quotes triumphantly the ancient theory, the sweet falsehood, that beauty is the flower of virtue. Experience looks grave, and though when the radiant eye peeps out upon him, he stands half convinced, yet still he musters his saws, his conspiring traditions and rules of the wise, his observations on the living, his analogies, and, what he chiefly relies on, the impression formerly made on the same heart by other and loftier qualities, which reason and stoicism justified. A pretty plea, no doubt, but if the daemon of the man should throw him into circumstances favorable to the sentiment, reason would stand on a perilous, unsteady footing. The terms of intercourse in society are singularly unpropitious to the virtuous curiosity of young men with regard to the inner qualities of a beautiful woman. They may only see the outside of the house they want to buy. The chance is very greatly against her possessing those virtues and general principle which they most value, for they know of what delicacy and rarity is the nature of those fruits, and with what difficult and long separated steps they themselves reach them. Yet a mighty testimony is afforded to the moral harmony of human nature, and the fact that the deportment of a beautiful woman in the presence of her admirer never offends point blank against the great laws of whose violation would surely shock him. Emerson writes on the splendor of English poetry. Is it not true, what we so reluctantly hear, that men are but the mouthpiece of a great progressive destiny, inasmuch as regards literature? I had rather asked, is not the age gone by of great splendor of English poetry, and will it not be impossible for any age soon to vie with the pervading ethereal poesy of Herbert, Shakespeare, Marvell, Herrick, Milton, Ben Jonson, at least to represent anything like their peculiar form of ravishing verse? It is the head of human poetry. Homer and Virgil and Dante and Tasso and Byron and Wordsworth have powerful genius whose amplest claims I cheerfully acknowledge. but 'tis a pale ineffectual fire when theirs shines. They would lie on my shelf in undisturbed honor for years if the Saxon lays stole my ear. I have for them an affectionate admiration, I have for nothing else. They set me on speculations, they move my wonder at myself, they suggest the great endowment of the spiritual man, they open glimpses of the heaven that is in the intellect. When I am caught by a magic word and drop the book to explore the infinite charm, to run along the line of that ray, I feel the longevity of the mind. I admit the evidence of the immortality of the soul. Well, as I said, I am afraid the season of this rare fruit is irrevocably past, that the earth is made such a nutation of its nodes that the heat will never reach again that Hesperian garden in which alone these apricots and pomegranates grew. Divinity Hall, December 20th, 1828. Forgive our sins. Were it not desirable that we should have a guardian angel that should go on our errands between heaven and earth, that we should tell us how God receives our actions, when he smiles and when he frowns, what petitions he hears with favor and what he rejects? Well, we have such a report rendered back to us. Consider this prayer. Forgive our sins. I believe every man may answer to himself when he utters this ejaculation the precise degree of consideration it has received from the Almighty Mind. That consideration depends wholly upon the sentiment which accompanied the prayer. If when I say forgive my sins, I am in a frame of mind that sorrowfully repents of all my perversity, if I am struck with a deep and contrite sense of the enormity of sin, if I feel the evil of guilt and the virtue to sin no more, then God hears me. Concord, New Hampshire, December 21st, 1828. I have now been 4 days engaged to Ellen Louisa Tucker. Will my Father in heaven regard us with kindness, and as he hath, as we trust, made us for each other, will he be pleased to strengthen and purify and prosper and eternize our affection? Then there is a annotation here from the editor. On Edward's happy recovery of his mental balance, though his general health was permanently broken, Waldo took him for a change with him to Concord, New Hampshire, where he had engagements to preach for 3 Sundays in December. In a letter to his brother William, announcing his engagement, he said, quote, "It is now just a year since I became acquainted with Ellen, but I thought I had got over my blushes and my wishes when I now determined to go into that dangerous neighborhood on Edward's account. But the presumptuous man was overthrown by the eye and ear, and surrendered at discretion. He is now as happy as it is safe in life to be. She is 17 years old, and very beautiful by universal consent." End quote. A little before this time, Mr. Emerson had been asked by the committee of the Second Church in Boston to become associate pastor, on account of the delicate health and need of travel of the Reverend Henry Ware, Jr., the pastor, and was considering whether he ought to accept the call. And that is the end of Emerson's collection of journal entries entitled Journal 19. In the following video, we will continue to Journal 20, when Emerson is minister of the Second Church of Boston. Thank you for listening.